Thanksgiving was supposed to be peaceful this year, or at least that's what I kept telling myself as I drove the 3 hours back to my parents' home in Connecticut, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Because ever since Dad's heart scare last spring and Mom's quiet emotional withdrawal afterward, I'd convinced myself family mattered more than old wounds and past arguments. But the moment I stepped through the front door and heard the fake excitement in my sister Claire's voice, look who finally decided to show up. I knew I'd been lying to myself. The house smelled like roasted turkey, buttered rolls, and cinnamon candles, the kind Mom lit every November. But under all of that was tension, thick enough to taste, and I felt it when Claire hugged me too tightly, her smile too wide, her eyes too sharp, like she was savoring some private joke. I brushed it off, setting down my overnight bag, greeting Mom, who kissed my cheek distractedly, and Dad, who squeezed my shoulder but wouldn't quite meet my eyes, and even then a quiet unease settled in my stomach like a warning I couldn't name. Dinner started normally enough, everyone passing plates, my parents asking about my new job in Boston, Claire interrupting to brag about her promotion, her fiancé Tyler chiming in about wedding venues, all the usual noise. But somewhere between the mashed potatoes and the cranberry sauce, I noticed Mom and Dad exchanging glances, nervous ones, and Claire sitting a little too straight, her smile glued to her face like she was waiting for a spotlight. Then, just as Mom opened her mouth to say something, Claire slammed her fork down with a crisp clink and said loudly, "Well, since they're too scared to announce it, I guess I'll do it." And before anyone could react, she pushed her chair back, stood, raised her wine glass like she was giving a toast, and said with theatrical cheer, "Mom and Dad are signing the house over to me." And she pointed dramatically at me, her sister, her only sibling. "You get nothing." And I swear the whole dining room tilted. My fork slipped from my numb fingers, landing in my plate with a soft thud as I stared at her, half expecting her to laugh and say it was a joke, but her grin only sharpened as she looked around the table waiting for applause like she had just delivered something joyful instead of detonating a bomb. Dad rubbed his temples. Mom stared at her plate, and my voice finally emerged, hoarse and barely audible. "What are you talking about?" But Claire just laughed coldly, swirling her wine like a villain in a cheap drama. "Oh, come on, Aaron. Don't play dumb. You know you've always been the one doing your own thing, moving away, acting like the world owed you something. Meanwhile, I stayed here. I took care of Mom and Dad. I helped with everything. So yeah, they've decided to reward the child who actually cared." And the words scraped across my nerves like broken glass because it wasn't true, any of it. I had moved to Boston for work, yes, but I visited, I called, I helped with bills when Dad got sick, and Claire knew that, but facts never mattered when she wanted something. I looked at my parents, desperate for one of them to speak up, deny it, correct her, explain this was a misunderstanding, but Mom only sighed and whispered, "Aaron, sweetie, maybe we should talk about this later." And Dad's face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he muttered, "It's complicated." And for the first time in my life, I felt something sharp and foreign stabbing under my ribs. Betrayal. Pure and bright and blinding. Claire sank back into her chair smugly, taking a sip of wine and adding, "Oh, and they've already started the paperwork. The lawyer said it should be finalized before Christmas," which felt like another slap because I hadn't heard a word about any of this. Not a phone call, not a text, nothing. And suddenly, every strange moment from the past few months clicked into place. Mom refusing to talk about finances, Dad brushing off questions about the house, Claire acting unbearably cheerful, Tyler helping with repairs even though he hated manual labor. They had planned this, all of them, behind my back, like I didn't exist, like I wasn't part of this family at all. Anger surged up my throat, but grief drowned it. leaving me staring at my plate as Claire leaned in with faux sympathy. Don't take it personally, sis. Some people are just meant to build their own life somewhere else. And she said it with such condescension, I almost choked. I finally forced myself to ask, why didn't anyone tell me? But Mom wouldn't look at me, and Dad only muttered, we didn't want to upset you before the holidays, as if finding out now, publicly humiliated at Thanksgiving dinner, made it better. I felt heat rising behind my eyes but refused to cry, not in front of her, not in front of them, and I pushed my chair back, whispered, excuse me, and walked to the kitchen, my legs shaking, my heart hammering. The world spinning with betrayal so heavy I could barely breathe. I gripped the counter, fighting tears, when I heard footsteps and, of course, it was Claire, leaning against the doorway like she owned the entire house already, her voice dripping with satisfaction as she said softly, you should have known this was coming. And for the first time in my life, I saw her not as my sister, but as someone who enjoyed watching me break. I stared at Claire in the kitchen doorway, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence like a warning siren, and for a moment I couldn't speak because everything inside me was twisted. Rage, confusion, heartbreak. Like someone had grabbed my chest and wrung it out. Claire smirked like she was waiting for me to crumble, and when I didn't, she clicked her tongue and said, don't look so shocked, Aaron. You've always acted like the outsider. Now you finally are. And something in me snapped because I realized she wasn't just enjoying the moment. She had planned it, rehearsed it, savored it. She wanted an audience for my humiliation, wanted to twist the knife where it hurt most, and I suddenly saw every memory differently. The times she guilt-tripped me for not visiting enough, the times she helped Mom and Dad but bragged about it endlessly, the way she always turned family issues into performance pieces where she was the martyr and I was the disappointment. I took a step toward her, voice low so our parents couldn't hear. Why are you doing this? What did I ever do to you? And for the first time her smile faltered, replaced by something darker and sharper, a bitterness that made her eyes harden as she hissed. You existed, and as much as it stung, it made something click in my mind. This wasn't about the house, not really. This was about years of jealousy she'd buried under fake kindness and forced sisterhood. She hated that I'd left Connecticut, built a life that wasn't tied to our parents, gotten a job, made friends. She hated that I wasn't trapped the way she felt trapped. I took a shaky breath and said, you could have told me. We could have talked, but she rolled her eyes, crossing her arms like a bratty teenager instead of a 30-year-old woman. Please. If I told you early, you'd have cried and guilt Mom and Dad into changing their minds. This way, it's done. And the smug finality in her voice made my stomach churn. I brushed past her, needing air, needing distance before I screamed, but as I walked back into the dining room, Dad finally spoke, his voice small and ashamed. Aaron, sit please, and Mom whispered, honey, we didn't mean for it to come out like that, but the damage was already bone deep. I forced myself to sit, though my legs trembled, and waited in silence as they tried to explain. Dad talking about wanting to reward the child who stayed close. Mom insisting it was practical because Claire will need the house when she has kids, and I sat there numb, because no matter how they tried to soften it, it all meant the same thing. They had already chosen her over me. They had written me out quietly and cleanly, like removing a line from a grocery list. I finally asked, did you ever intend to tell me? And Mom froze, because the answer was obvious. They weren't going to tell me until it was already too late to fight it. Claire jumped in then, waving her fork dismissively. Don't make this dramatic. You moved away. You chose your life.
Oui, chose ours.
That was when something in me broke. Not loudly, not visibly, but in a deep, silent way that felt permanent. I stood again, ignoring Mom's soft, pleading, Aaron, wait, and walked toward the front door, needing to breathe air that wasn't poisoned by betrayal. Claire followed, of course, the queen of not knowing when to shut up, and grabbed my arm in the hallway, hissing, "If you try to contest the house legally, it won't work." I already checked. And that sentence, "I already checked," hit me like a punch because she hadn't just taken what she wanted. She'd done research, asked lawyers, covered loopholes, all behind my back. She had been preparing for this moment for months, maybe years. I pulled my arm away like her touch burned and said quietly, "Enjoy the house," even though the words tasted like blood, because saying anything else would have meant begging, and I refused to beg someone who enjoyed seeing me break. I walked out the front door, the cold air slamming into me like a slap, and sat on the porch steps, burying my face in my hands as everything inside me finally spilled over. The grief, the humiliation, the realization that I was alone in a way I had never felt before. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps behind me. Not Claire's sharp heels, but Dad's slow shuffle, and he sat beside me, silent at first, then whispering. It wasn't supposed to happen that way, and I let out a humorless laugh because of course he said that. Of course he cared more about the awkward delivery than the betrayal itself. "Dad," I whispered, voice cracking, "why didn't you talk to me?" And he sighed, rubbing his face like he aged 10 years in one night. "Your mother thought you'd fight it, and I didn't want conflict." And there it was, the truth neither of them wanted to say out loud. They had chosen the easy child, the compliant child, the one who wouldn't question them. But what hurt most was that he said it with shame, not malice, because he knew it was wrong, but he didn't stop it anyway. I swallowed the lump in my throat and asked the question that burned. "Do you love her more than me?" Dad looked pained, shaking his head fiercely. "No. God, no. But she's always needed us more, and you've always taken care of yourself." And I almost laughed because independence isn't a crime, but somehow they were using it as justification to erase me. Dad put a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "You're stronger than she is." And even though it wasn't meant to hurt, it did, because strength shouldn't be a punishment. Eventually, Mom called Dad back inside to help serve dessert, and he left reluctantly, whispering, "Please don't go home tonight. Stay. We can talk more tomorrow." But the thought of staying under that roof one more minute felt suffocating. As the door closed behind him, I stared up at the house I grew up in, the house I loved, the house I just lost, and an ache I didn't know how to swallow settled deep in my chest. I thought the worst was over. I thought the betrayal was done. But what I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that this Thanksgiving wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of a truth that would shatter everything we thought we knew about Claire, about the house, and about the reason my parents gave it to her in the first place. That I didn't go back inside the house right away. Instead, I sat there on the porch, letting the cold November air numb my fingers and my thoughts, trying to process the fact that my own family had made a monumental decision about our childhood home, my home, and no one had bothered to include me. But the longer I sat there, the more something gnawed at me, a detail so small I almost ignored it. Claire saying she already checked the legal options, like she'd mapped out every possible challenge I could make. That didn't sound like impulsive entitlement. It sounded like fear disguised as confidence, like someone who wasn't securing a reward but defending something. That thought stayed with me as I finally forced myself back into the house to grab my purse, hoping to leave quietly before Claire could corner me again. But when I stepped into the hallway, voices drifted from the dining room, hushed, tense, urgent. And even though I knew eavesdropping wasn't morally brilliant, I couldn't stop myself from pausing behind the wall to listen. Mom sounded strained, her voice breaking as she said, "Claire, you shouldn't have told her like that." And Claire hissed back, "She was going to find out anyway. Better now than when the paperwork is filed." And Mom whispered desperately, "She's your sister." But Claire's reply made my stomach tighten into a knot. I don't care. I'm not losing this house. Not after everything I've dealt with. And the bitterness in her tone wasn't about fairness or inheritance. It was fear, trembling under every syllable. Dad tried soothing her. No one is taking the house from you. But Claire snapped, "You don't understand, Dad. If she contests it, if anything gets delayed, if anyone else finds out." She stopped abruptly, breath catching like she'd revealed too much, and Dad lowered his voice. "We promised we wouldn't talk about that tonight." And my entire body went cold, because what exactly were they promising not to talk about? What secret tied to the house was so big they were hiding it from me entirely? I stepped away quickly before they saw me, heart pounding, and grabbed my coat from the foyer, ready to leave and clear my head before I spiraled. But as I reached for the doorknob, the front door opened suddenly. Tyler, Claire's fiancé, stumbled in with a folder clutched under his arm, face flushed like he'd been drinking or arguing or both, and when he saw me, he froze like a deer in headlights. "Oh," he said awkwardly, "you're still here." And I muttered, "Not for long." But before I could step around him, a slip of paper fell out of his folder and fluttered onto the floor at my feet. Instinctively, I reached down and picked it up, and immediately felt my stomach drop because it wasn't just any paper, it was a notice of default on the house mortgage, dated 3 months ago, with a giant red stamp reading "Final Notice" across the top. I stared at it, then at him, and whispered, "What is this?" And Tyler's expression twisted with panic as he snatched it from my hand, stuffing it back into the folder, stammering, "Nothing. It's just paperwork." But the guilt radiating off him was suffocating. Before he could bolt, I grabbed his arm, surprising him and myself with the force in my grip, and demanded, "Tyler, what is going on with the house?" And he said nothing, his eyes darting toward the dining room like a child caught stealing cookies, and that was enough of an answer. I pushed past him, stormed into the dining room, and slammed the folder onto the table so hard the wine glasses rattled, scattering silverware and sending cranberry sauce sloshing onto the tablecloth. Everyone froze, Dad halfway through a sentence, Mom gripping her napkin, Claire mid-eye roll. And then I said the words that blew their comfortable little performance apart. "The house is in foreclosure." Mom gasped, Dad cursed under his breath. Tyler looked like he might pass out, and Claire, perfect, polished, smug Claire, went pale in a way I had never seen before. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, voice cracking, and I said, "From your fiancé's folder. You're losing the house, aren't you? That's why you didn't want me involved. Because if I knew, I'd ask questions." Mom started crying softly. Dad looked like someone had punched him, and Claire slammed her hand on the table, hissing, "This is none of your business." But I laughed, a cold, humorless laugh, because of course she'd say that. "It becomes my business when you announce you're taking everything from me to hide this." I shot back, and that was when Dad finally broke, his voice trembling. "We're not hiding it to hurt you, Aaron. We're hiding it because we're embarrassed." And he explained, haltingly, painfully, that they had taken out a second mortgage to help Claire get back on her feet after she lost her job last year, but then she didn't make payments. Then Tyler lost money in a business venture, and suddenly they were months behind with the bank threatening repossession. Claire jumped in, crying now, makeup smudging. "I didn't want you to know, okay? I didn't want you to think I ruined everything." And that admission hit me harder than any insult she'd thrown earlier. She wasn't proud of stealing the house. She was drowning in guilt, in pressure, in fear, and she thought taking the house would somehow shield her from a reality she had created. But as heart-wrenching as her vulnerability looked, another, sharper truth sliced through. "So you took it out on me," I whispered, voice shaking, "because you were terrified I'd see the mess you made," and her silence was answer enough. Tyler tried stepping closer to her, but Dad held up a hand, stopping him, and said quietly to all of us, "We thought if we put the house in Claire's name, the bank might give us more time. It was stupid,
Desperate.
and unfair to you." I sank into the nearest chair, head spinning, because the betrayal I felt was now tangled with pity and disbelief. I finally asked the question no one else dared to voice. "Are you going to lose the house?" Mom nodded, tears falling. "If we don't come up with the back payments within a month, yes." And then, in the quiet, suffocating moment that followed, Claire whispered the confession that shattered the last illusion I had about my sister. "I didn't tell you the truth because I thought you'd save us." Her words hung in the air like poison. "I thought you'd save us." And for a long moment no one moved, no one breathed, because the truth wasn't just ugly now, it was suffocating. Claire hadn't wanted the house out of greed or entitlement alone. She wanted a shield, a lifeline, and in her twisted, panicked logic, I was the lifeline she thought she could manipulate. I stared at her, my chest tight, my voice barely a whisper as I said, "Save you? With what? My salary? My savings?" "Claire, I'm not a bank." And she wiped her nose with the back of her hand, mascara streaking down her face, shaking her head frantically. "No, not money. I mean, you've always been the responsible one. You would have taken control. You would have fixed things. You always fix things." And that was when I realized something terrible. In her mind, I was less a sister and more a tool, a solution she felt entitled to because I had always cleaned up her messes growing up. The test she didn't study for, the boyfriend she broke up with, the rent she forgot to pay. In her mind, adulthood hadn't changed the dynamic at all, and this time the stakes were catastrophic. Mom tried stepping in then, her voice trembling. "Claire didn't mean it that way." And I snapped, "Then how did she mean it?" Because I was done smoothing edges and swallowing my anger just to keep the peace. Dad sank into his chair, rubbing his face with both hands, looking older than I had ever seen him, whispering, "We made a mistake. Several, actually." And Tyler finally spoke, rubbing the back of his neck, voice quiet but defensive. "We didn't think the bank would move this fast. We thought we'd have time to catch up." I rounded on him, fury sharpening my voice. "You mean you thought that? You gambled with their home." He opened his mouth, but no excuse came out.
Good.
Because the truth was too big for excuses now. I pressed my hand to my forehead, pacing, heart pounding as every piece of the tangled puzzle began fitting together in the worst possible way. They weren't giving Claire the house because she deserved it. They were giving it to her because the bank was circling, and they thought putting everything in her name would somehow stall the consequences. The inheritance conversation wasn't really an inheritance conversation at all. It was a cover story, a shield, a distraction meant for the neighbors, the relatives, and apparently me. And Claire, instead of admitting any of this, had chosen to humiliate me in front of everyone to hide her own failures, her own fear, her own impending disaster. I exhaled shakily and asked the question I was afraid to know the answer to. "How far behind are you?" Dad hesitated, then whispered, "For months." And that was enough to make my knees nearly buckle. For months meant the house was already deep into the foreclosure pipeline. For months meant lawyers were probably involved. For months meant they were drowning long before Thanksgiving, long before Claire opened her big mouth at the table. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, voice cracking, and Dad whispered, "Because we didn't want to drag you into this." And Claire cut in bitterly, "But you always get dragged in anyway, Aaron. That's who you are." And there it was again. That twisted belief that my entire existence revolved around solving problems she created. My breathing grew tight, frustration clawing at my chest, and before I could stop myself, I said the one truth I had held back for years. "You don't want a sister. You want a safety net." Claire flinched like I'd slapped her, which almost made me feel bad, but not enough to take it back. Tyler stepped toward her as if shielding her from my words, but I kept going, my voice cold with the betrayal I had swallowed all night. You wanted me to stay quiet earlier not because you wanted peace, but because you didn't want me to expose the truth. You wanted to control the narrative, so everyone would think you earned this. You wanted to feel superior while hiding the fact that you're drowning. Claire's chin trembled. She opened her mouth, but Mom rushed forward, grabbing my hand like she was afraid I'd walk out forever, pleading, "Aaron, please, we didn't want you to feel burdened." And that word, burdened, hit me harder than the announcement earlier because suddenly everything made sense. My independence wasn't something they admired. It was something they weaponized. A justification to exclude me when it was convenient and include me only when they needed saving. I pulled my hand away gently and whispered, "You didn't want me burdened, but you were fine burdening me with humiliation." Mom's face crumpled. Dad looked away. Claire burst into tears. And for the first time all night, the silence was honest, not thick with secrets, not filled with rehearsed lines, just raw, painful truth none of us could escape anymore. After a long moment, Dad finally spoke, voice cracked, defeated. "We don't know what to do. We don't want to lose the house. It's all we have left of everything." His voice broke on the last word, and I felt a pang of sympathy despite everything. This house wasn't just brick and wood. It was memories, childhood, safety. It was family. But then Claire whispered something that chilled me to my core. "It's not just the house we're going to lose." Everyone turned to her. She looked between Mom and Dad with fear in her eyes, swallowing hard before saying, "I didn't tell you the whole truth about why we fell behind." My heart lurched. "What do you mean?" Her voice strained, barely holding together. "It's not just missed payments. It's something else. Something I never wanted you to find out." She clutched the mortgage papers with a trembling hand, and for the first time, I saw real terror in her eyes. Not entitlement, not arrogance, fear. "The house is in foreclosure," she whispered, "because someone put a lien on it." My breath caught. A lien? From who? Claire closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheek. "From someone I owe money to someone dangerous. And if we don't pay him, he's not just taking the house. He's taking everything." For a moment, no one reacted. Not Mom, not Dad, not Tyler, not even me, because Claire's words didn't make sense at first, like my brain refused to process them. But then the meaning hit, sharp and merciless. Someone dangerous had a legal claim on our childhood home, and Claire had known, and she had let us believe this was all just irresponsible budgeting or missed payments, when in reality, it was something far darker. Dad finally found his voice, shaky and thin. "Claire, what did you do?" And she crumpled into her chair like her bones gave out, covering her face with both hands, sobbing. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could pay him back before anyone found out." And Mom rushed to her side, her instinct to comfort overpowering everything else. But Dad's face hardened for the first time that night, his voice sharp with fear rather than anger. "Claire, who put the lien on the house?" And she let out a shaky, broken breath before whispering a name that made Tyler stiffen instantly. "Elliot Kane." And even though I didn't know the name, Tyler clearly did, because his face drained of every bit of color as he whispered, "Oh God." "Claire, no, not him." And my stomach twisted painfully. I stepped closer, my voice low and trembling. "Who is he?" And Tyler looked at me with eyes that were suddenly older, haunted, like he'd been carrying this secret far longer than he'd admit. "Elliot Kane is not just some guy," he said quietly. "He's a loan shark who pretends to run a consulting business. The type of man who doesn't send reminders, he sends warnings." And Claire sobbed harder, gripping Tyler's sleeve. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what he was until it was too late. I thought he was just a private lender. I needed money for the wedding deposit after the venue raised the price. Tyler said he knew someone who could help quickly. Tyler flinched, guilt slicing through him as he whispered, I told you not to borrow that much. I told you he wasn't someone to trust. But Claire's voice cracked like ice as she snapped. You told me not to worry. You said he'd give us more time. You said he'd be reasonable. And suddenly their perfect engagement, their perfect wedding plans, their perfect Instagram-ready life shattered into the truth. They were drowning in debt, desperate to maintain an image, and had dragged my parents home into their mess. I felt anger rise in my throat, hot, acidic, overwhelming, but underneath it was something worse. Fear, cold and deep. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady as I asked, How much do you owe him? And Claire whispered so softly I almost missed it, 40,000, and Mom gasped, clutching her chest. Dad closed his eyes like he'd been punched, and Tyler whispered a curse under his breath. We can't pay that, Dad said weakly. We don't have that kind of money. And Claire nodded miserably. I know. And Elliot said that if we didn't start paying soon, he'd take what was his, and I whispered, the house. And Claire nodded again, tears streaming. Everything in the room felt small and suffocating now. The walls closing in, the air tightening, the house that had once been warmth and childhood now a trap held by a man who didn't care if he destroyed the people inside it. Dad stood suddenly, pacing, gripping his hair like he wanted to tear it out, whispering, Why didn't you come to us? Why didn't you tell us? And Claire cried, Because you always fix everything, Dad. Because you always treat me like I'm fragile, like I can't handle anything, and I didn't want to be the disappointment again. And her voice cracked into a sob that wasn't manipulative this time. It was raw, terrified, vulnerable. Mom held her, whispering softly, You're not a disappointment, sweetheart. But the truth hung heavy anyway. I leaned against the doorway, heart racing, mind spinning with numbers and timelines and consequences. This wasn't just a family argument anymore. This was a crisis with real stakes, dangerous stakes, stakes that could get someone hurt. And then, because my life loves irony, there was a knock at the front door. Everyone froze, staring at each other with wide, terrified eyes, the sound echoing down the hallway like a threat carved into sound. Dad whispered, No one was supposed to come tonight, and Tyler's voice dropped to a whisper. He said he'd give us one more week. He said, and Claire covered her mouth, shaking violently as the knock came again, louder this time. Dad took one step toward the hallway, but I reached out and grabbed his arm, whispering sharply, Don't, because everything inside me screamed that this wasn't a neighbor or a delivery driver. Mom clutched Claire tighter. Tyler backed away from the door like it might explode, and the third knock came, not loud, not aggressive, but deliberate, controlled, the kind of knock someone gives when they know you'll answer because they own your fear. Dad whispered, What do we do? And the silence that followed was suffocating until I finally found my voice and said something I never thought I'd say again in my life. Open the door. But let me stand beside you. Because if Elliot Kane was as dangerous as they said he was, then opening the door alone was suicide. But not opening it would be worse. We walked together down the hallway, slow as if wading into water we knew might drown us, and Dad's hand trembled as he reached for the knob. He unlocked it, and there, on the porch, stood a sharply dressed man in a black coat, dark hair slicked back, eyes calm in a way that made my blood run cold. He smiled politely, almost warmly, as he said, Good evening. I believe you know why I'm here. And before Dad could answer, the man's eyes flicked to me, curious, calculating, assessing, and he tilted his head with a quiet, unsettling smile, and, You must be the other daughter. My heart dropped. He knew who I was. He knew I was here. And I suddenly understood something horrifying. This wasn't about payments or contracts, or even the house anymore. Elliot Kane didn't just want money. He wanted leverage. And now he had two sisters instead of one. Elliot Kane's presence filled the doorway like a shadow swallowing light, his polite smile unsettling in its calmness, as if he were greeting old friends rather than a family standing on the edge of ruin. And when he stepped inside without waiting for permission, the air seemed to tighten with every footstep. Dad tried to find his voice, tried to stand tall, but his hands trembled too visibly, and Elliot's eyes swept over the living room slowly, like he was surveying property he already owned, before settling on Claire, who wilted under his gaze. "You look surprised," he said softly, almost amused, "but when your payment stopped, I assumed you'd be here with your parents tonight." Holidays bring families together, especially desperate ones, and his eyes flicked toward me, cold amusement shimmering just beneath the surface. And now I see the missing piece. The responsible daughter. I felt my spine stiffen, but I refused to show fear, meeting his gaze even as Claire whimpered, "Please, Elliot, we just need time." But he held up a hand, silencing her instantly. "Time is expensive, Claire. And you've already used more than you can afford." His voice was calm, eloquent, controlled, and that made him more terrifying than if he'd shouted. Tyler stepped in front of Claire, stammering, We can pay something soon. I'm starting a new job." But Elliot didn't let him finish. "You owe $40,000. Starting a job at a car dealership isn't going to cover that." And Tyler went silent, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own guilt. Elliot sighed lightly, as if bored of theatrics, and reached into his coat, pulling out a stack of papers, legal notices, contracts, debt agreements, dropping them onto the coffee table with a soft thud that echoed louder than a gunshot. "Normally," he said, clasping his hands behind his back, "I would simply take the house. But Claire made an interesting claim when she borrowed the money." He paused, watching Claire crumble, and Mom gasped when she realized what he meant, whispering, "Claire, what did you tell him?" And Claire shook her head frantically, sobbing, I told him something so he'd trust me, so he'd think the family had money." And my whole body froze as Elliot finished the sentence for her, turning to me with a soft, cruel smile. "She said you would cover her. That you always do." My blood went cold. "She what?" Claire broke then, collapsing against Mom, crying, "I didn't mean it literally. I was panicking. I just told him you had savings and a high-paying job." And Elliot chuckled. "She painted you as the safety net." Quite convincingly. I wanted to scream, to shake her, to ask how she could gamble my life like that, but Elliot wasn't done. He stepped closer, too close, and said softly, "So here's the deal. Either the $40,000 appears by next Friday, or I take the house." And when that's gone, his eyes locked onto mine with chilling clarity. "I come to you." Dad exploded then, shoving himself between us, shouting, "Absolutely not. You leave my daughters alone." And for a moment, I saw the father I grew up with, the protector, the steady one, but Elliot didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even seem bothered. Instead, he leaned in slightly, voice dropping to a whisper that felt like ice sliding across my skin. "You made your daughter responsible for your debts the moment you let Claire use your house as collateral. That was your mistake, not mine." Dad's shoulders collapsed under the truth. Mom sobbed silently. Claire's cries grew louder, and I stood there in the middle of the wreckage, feeling every part of me splitting. Anger, betrayal, fear, heartbreak, until something inside me snapped back into place with stunning clarity. "We're not paying you a cent," I said. Elliot turned, eyebrows lifting, amused. I continued, "This entire arrangement was illegal. You coerced her into signing papers she didn't understand. You threatened her, and you filed a lien using predatory tactics." If you try to enforce it, I'll go to the police, the state attorney, and every consumer protection agency in Connecticut. Claire gasped. Dad looked terrified, but Elliot only smiled. You think I'm worried about the law? I held his gaze.
No.
But you should be worried about witnesses. I pointed to the dining room, where Tyler stood petrified. About the threats you just made. I pointed to the stack of papers with illegal interest rates printed in bold. About the proof you left behind. Elliot's smile twitched. Just a hint. A crack. And I finished slowly. You should be worried about someone who has nothing left to lose. Silence.
Thick. Heavy.
Unpredictable. The kind that changes everything. Elliot's jaw tightened. For the first time, he took one slow step back, eyes narrowing as he recalculated me. The girl he thought was quiet, weak, harmless, and realized I wasn't any of those things. Finally, he exhaled sharply through his nose and said, You have 1 week. Then he walked out.
Just like that.
But the threat he left in his wake lingered in every corner of the house. When the door closed, the dam finally broke, Mom sobbing, Dad sinking into a chair like his legs gave out, Tyler pacing in panic, Claire collapsing into hysterics, but I didn't cry, not this time. Instead, I walked to the papers, gathered them, scanned the signatures, the dates, the violations, and realized something else. We had leverage too. Nobody is losing this house, I said quietly. They all looked at me. For once, Claire's eyes weren't filled with arrogance. They were filled with remorse and fear. I'm going to fix this, I added. But after this, things change. Claire nodded rapidly, tears streaming. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I know, I said, voice soft but firm. But sorry isn't enough anymore. Over the next week, I worked with a legal aid attorney, filed harassment claims, reported Elliot's predatory lending practices, froze the lien, and secured a court order forcing investigation. Elliot backed off, not because he was scared of us, but because he was scared of exposure. And the house?
Saved.
But the family?
Different.
Claire apologized every day. Real apologies, the kind that hurt to speak. Mom and Dad vowed to never hide anything again. And me? I learned a truth I wish I'd known earlier. Sometimes family breaks you. But sometimes you rebuild together, stronger, clearer, with boundaries made of steel. On Christmas Eve, as we sat around the table, quiet, tired, healing, Dad squeezed my hand and whispered, You didn't just save the house. You saved us. I didn't reply. I just let the warmth in my chest answer for me. Because for the first time in years, I finally felt like part of the family again.